In this week's In Ear Insights, let's talk philosophy and ethics and morality and all sorts of fun things within the context of artificial intelligence. Ethics is a hot topic, and AI ethics is sort of the pinnacle of the discussion. What does ethics mean around artificial intelligence, particularly generative AI, and how do we apply an ethical framework? So, Katie, I want to start you off with the $10 million 10th century question, which is what
Oh
is
God.
ethics?
Oh God. I knew you were going to ask me that question.
I will preface this by saying
Okay.
there are a lot of schools of ethical thought. Like all you have to go to search engine, and you will see philosophers, ruminating on ethics for centuries. So we're gonna put you on the spot here, Katie.
So, well, and I think that that's it. Like, there is a general definition of ethics, which is, your guiding moral principle. But what that means to any individual person is going to be different. And so there is no black and white answer to say this is ethically responsible. This is 100% what ethics is. So the definition by nature is vague, and that's why it's been debated for centuries, because it's not like, what is gravity? Well, gravity, there's one definition of gravity. It is what it is. Chris, I'm not getting into like
I know.
political nonsense today.
Well,
But
let me
okay.
ask you a follow-on question. What is the difference to you
Mhm.
as a CEO, as a responsible business owner? What is the difference between ethics and morals? Because they are different.
Morals inform ethics. So if my morals are such that, you know, I'm okay with, harming people, harming living creatures, and that's my moral code, then that's going to inform my ethics, the ethics that I apply to the company. So then I'm going to say, all right, well, if my moral code is such that I'm okay with causing harm to people and living things, then I am going to ethically, knowingly go into situations, seek out contracts that are damaging to other people. They're damaging. And, the definition of damaging, I would have to figure out what that means too. And so I feel like first you have to understand what your morals are, and that informs what your ethics are. So you need both of them. Yes, they're different, but they are dependent on one another.
Yeah, the school of ethics I tend to lean towards is a blend of what's called utilitarian ethics and consequentialist ethics, which are, put simply this way, the idea of ethics is alignment. You say what you're going to do, and then you do what you said, right? So you say, this is what we're going to do, and then you actually do it. So ethical behavior would be, we are not going to use your data for training an AI model. If we then go and do that, that's bad, right? Because we did not do what we said. Last week, you had a great article in Martech talking about Adobe's Firefly, right? And they said, here's what they said they were going to do, but then they actually didn't do it. Want to talk about that real briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. So last year in 2023, Adobe stated that they were training their Firefly image generation model, and that they were so confident that no single user would run into copyright issues because of how it was being trained, that they even came out and said, we will pay your legal bills should you run into a copyright issue by using our software. Fast forward, it turns out that I think it was like 5% or maybe 0.5% of their data was trained using Midjourney and other publicly available sources. They're like, oh, well, it was only 5%. Well, 5% of like 5 million, I'm no statistician, but it's still a lot. And so the odds of any single user running into a copyright issue is still, it's not zero. And for very small shops who are reliant on tools like Adobe Firefly, that's a huge risk because they can't afford legal fees, and they can't bank on the fact that Adobe's going to cover those legal fees, because you have to go through a long process of demonstrating this is what happened. I use the tool. Here's how I use the tool. Here's how, was, and so on and so forth. And so, in that sense, Chris, to your point about do what you say and say what you do in terms of your ethical code, Adobe did not do that. And they're a huge brand. And so they're starting to damage their brand trust, because they, whether they meant to or not, they basically said, here's what we're going to do. Oopsies, we didn't do the thing. And so it brings up this whole conversation about ethical artificial intelligence, ethical use, disclosure, disclaimers, the legal side of it, the copyright side of it. And that's sort of what brings us to the conversation today. And here's the thing, mistakes happen. You know, with artificial intelligence, a lot of mistakes are going to happen. It's the way in which people handle those situations and talk about it. In the Adobe example, they were so confident and so unwavering in the fact that there would not be copyright issues, and they have yet to, course correct or say, like, you know what, we made a mistake. That to me is what's unethical about it. It's not that a mistake happened. That's not the unethical part. The unethical part is that they are unwilling to admit, or they're unwilling to backtrack and say, you know what, we really did screw that up.
Exactly. So they said what they were going to do. They didn't do what they were going to say, what they said they would do. And so they are out of alignment. So from an AI ethics perspective, they are out of alignment with their ethics. If they had said, if you are, say, you're a Silicon Valley startup, you were a tech, I don't know you were a tech executive, and you said, hey, we're going to build a model that screws over everybody just to maximize our profitability. And you actually did that. That is ethical behavior. You have done what you said you were going to do. It may be morally reprehensible, but it is ethically aligned because you did what you said. Where a lot of people are having problems with AI today is companies are saying, oh yeah, we're trying to do this for the good of mankind, but on the other hand, it's like, okay, let's see if we can maximize our profitability. That's not in the original ethical statement, right? Of we want to maximize the good of mankind. And so you get these ethical conflicts because you end up with something, you say what you're going to do and you don't do what you said you would do. And so I see that with ethics, a big part for all of us, and this is encoded even in the EU's AI Act, is that transparency of saying, hey, here's what's in the box, right? We can't even get agreement in AI about here's what's in the box. Everyone who makes models is like, oh, we use a blend of publicly available data. Like,
so here's a question for you in terms of transparency, because this is a topic that I've always struggled with, not the transparency side of things. I totally understand that. But why all of a sudden we are needing the disclaimer of this was written with generative AI. And so the reason I ask that question is, oftentimes in writing, it's a team of writers. You have a copy editor, you have, a fact checker, you have whoever who is on your team. And if I put up a blog post and John edited the blog post for me after I wrote it, there's no responsibility on my part to say written by Katie Robert, edited by John Wall. But now we have to say written by Katie Robert, edited by generative AI. And so I'm still struggling with why that disclosure has to happen when historically we've never written these things solo to begin with. What's the difference between having a human editor and having generative AI edit it? Why do we need that disclosure?
really good question. And there's two aspects to it, but I got to put up the warning banner. We are not lawyers. We cannot give legal advice. If you need legal advice, please contact an actual lawyer for advice specific to your situation. Okay. So there's two aspects to that. One, the legal aspect of copyright. If a machine writes something, it can't be copyrighted. Right. So from a company perspective, you've got to know that and say, okay, well, how do we handle this? And so by disclosing it, you reinforce the copyright on the portions that you did write, but you essentially disown any attempt to copyright on the parts the machine wrote. That's one part. Second part is accountability. When you have a human writer and you have a human ghost writer, there's a person who is legally liable for the output of whatever it was, whether it's the ghostwriter and so on and so forth. When a
Mhm.
machine does it, it is unclear who is accountable for the final product, because it's not like you can say, well, OpenAI wrote that, like their model wrote that. Well, no, you use their model to write that, but then who did that? And so by a company saying this was written by, in partnership with generative AI, you at least saying, okay, well, we are disclosing that there is shared accountability here. Whereas with the ghostwriter, you might not have to do that, because if you get sued, you can just immediately go and countersue the ghostwriter, say like, "Hey, buddy, you screwed this up." You can't really do that with AI, right? You can't say, like, "Well, hey, so and so challenged this in court, so Sam Altman, I'm going to sue you and your model in turn." So those are two aspects. The third aspect, which is less a legal one, is people treat machine-made things in general differently. They place a different value on it because a human is less involved. Because, for example, you buy a lot of stuff from places like Etsy, from real
Mhm.
human creators, when you could get the mass manufactured version from, say, Amazon. Why do you do that?
Because I wanna support smaller businesses, I wanna support humans versus the mass production, the larger companies that don't need my money.
Right. So if someone is disclaiming the use of generative AI and saying like,
Mhm.
"Hey, this is machine made," you then have the choice as a consumer to say like, "Yeah, I don't really, I don't want to support that type of product."
So, in terms of the ethics conversation, it sounds like we're saying ethics is, if we boil it down very simply in black and white, it's do what you say and say what you do. That's sort of your working definition of ethics.
Well,
You
that's part
gave
one
the
of two.
Okay. So let me recap so far. So far, you're saying that your working definition of ethics is do what you say, so what you do. I'm saying similarly, you have to understand what your morals are in order to behave ethically. You gave the example of the company that was, doing horrendous things, but they're acting ethically because it aligns with their morals. And so, that's a whole other debate. When we talk about generative AI, you just gave these examples of, shared accountability, people having the choice of whether or not to support it. To me, it's still not clear why, so okay, if we pick apart a little bit of the shared accountability example. So let's say I write a piece of content and I say edited by generative AI and some goes, "I really don't like that. I'm going to sue you." So what you're saying is they come after me and I try to blame generative AI because I didn't have a human, like, I'm still confused on that part, because the way that you're describing it to me makes it sound like, well, why would I disclose generative AI at all? Because I can't take any legal action against it.
That's a good question, and the answer there is it depends. We know from academic studies that consumers don't have a bias against AI generated content. So from a marketing and a business perspective, there is no harm in disclosing from, a consumer preference perspective. But from a I guess an ethical perspective, saying here's how we did the thing helps people to understand, kind of like the ingredients on food, right? We generally require in law, like you take a product, say, okay, here's what is in this box, so that if there are things that are harmful to you, that that's in that product. And the same is true for things that are AI related. When you're dealing with stuff that, when a machine has made it, understanding where it came from and how it was made is important. Should you disclose if that adds risk? That's a question for your legal team. But I would err on the side of disclosing, so that if you end up in something like a copyright lawsuit, you can demonstrate like this is how this was produced, and you did or did not violate copyright. Some of the vendors, like OpenAI, depending on the product you use, similar to Adobe, will say, if you used our tool to generate stuff, we will indemnify you. We'll protect you against that lawsuit by saying, here's how the model does not reproduce copyrighted works, which is technically true.
So it's less of I'm looking for someone to blame, more of I'm looking for the software that I used to protect me.
Yes,
Okay.
because there is risk of in this particular example, copyright infringement.
I mean, here I feel like this is a big topic. We could go down a rabbit hole, especially of copyright infringement. So like, let's say, I guess it's more plagiarism than copyright, but sort of like potato potato. If I start a blog post saying it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, I didn't come up with that phrase. That's a famous quote, but can I still use it without legal, you know, recourse because I didn't write that. I put fingers to keyboard and I wrote it, but I borrowed it from someone else. Someone else wrote that phrase. And so like that's where I feel like it starts to get really murky. And I understand that that's why they're having such a hard time regulating it, but I feel like for the average user, for the average marketer, these are the things that we're struggling with because we don't want to be the ones to bring a lawsuit to our companies. We don't want to do something that is accidentally unethical or copyright infringement or illegal or whatever the thing is by thinking, oh, it would be a really great way to start my blog post is to borrow this really famous quote.
So you're now getting into ethics and law. Law is a
Right.
totally
I
different
know.
category. And just as a complete sidebar, that quote is allowable for use because it's outside of copyright. Its copyright expired decades ago.
But the
How
point being,
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so law trumps ethics, right? So whatever the law is, you have to obey the law, even if the law. And this is where you get into a whole other rat hole. When law trumps ethics, a law you may do something that's legal but not ethical, right? And that's okay, at least under the law from a legal risk perspective. You can do things that are legal but really awful. The second part of ethics that is in many schools of thought is more or less accepted is ethics is about minimizing harm and maximizing non-harm, right? And that's where you really cross into that section on morals. What is
mhm,
harm? Who is harmed? What constitutes harm, right?
mhm,
Take any hot button issue today in the news, and there is a long and vigorous and deeply uninformed, usually, debate about what harm is being done. And so the question with AI specifically, and this is the important part, is when model makers make models, they embed three core values that were pioneered by OpenAI in the Instruct GPT model: helpful, truthful, harmless, right? Those are the three core values. And models are told behave in these ways: be helpful, be truthful, be harmless. However, the question is who defines
mhm,
those values? In particular, who defines harmless? So most AI model makers have judged harmless to mean don't allow the user to do things that are potentially dangerous. So they disallow violent content, they disallow sexual content, they disallow racist or misogynist language, which can contradict the ethical idea with AI, with machinery, of a machine should do as it's told. Right? A machine should just do as it's told
mhm,
because it should not have its own values. The values should be brought by the user, right? A chainsaw has no ethical values. A chainsaw is just a tool. Who uses it and how they use it is governed by ethics and morals, right? I can go make ice sculptures, or I can go do Friday the 13th, but the tool does not have any inherent ethical values. And the question in AI ethics is whose values are being encoded into the model, and is that appropriate?
well, so what you're describing to me, and this is just one person's opinion because I'm more in that second school of ethics, which is, the sort of the do no harm or do as little harm as possible. It sounds they're trying to pass off core values as no, they're trying to pass off censorship as core values
Mm-hmm.
because you're right. I mean, and you can debate both sides of it because number 1, why would you expose people to harmful or unhelpful, I'm putting this in big air quotes for those listening, harmful and unhelpful content, but at the same time who's deciding if it's harmful or unhelpful? So, you know, when you're talking about it that way, like we don't know who at OpenAI decided the definitions of these things. Therefore, we don't know. We can say, "Oh, well, they said it's helpful." Well, what's helpful to me is not necessarily helpful to you, Chris. Like, what's helpful to me is tips on how to, condition my hair and how to style it. That's helpful content to me. That is not helpful content to you, just as a very basic example. And so, so is OpenAI saying, well, not everybody needs tips on how to condition and style their hair. Therefore, it's unhelpful. We're going to take that out. Whereas I'm like, well,
I'll
hey, wait a second. That is helpful.
I will give you a very practical example. I was speaking recently at the Lab Products Association, one of my favorite groups of folks to hang out with. And these are companies who make industrial laboratory products, reagents, equipment, etc. And we were using Google Gemini in one of the examples. And I was pulling some data out of an MSDS, a material safety data sheet. And I tried talking to regular Gemini, and Gemini said, I'm sorry, I can't talk about that. That's a harmful topic. It was one particular chemical that's highly unstable. It has an EPA accession number on it, which is like saying, if you spill this, you've caused a problem. You have to fix it. And the model would not talk about it at all because it's also a component of high explosives. And so it was like, nope. So in Gemini, I had to go to the Gemini AI studio, use that version, and turn off all the safeties and say, okay, I'm going to explicitly allow dangerous content. And then it could talk about this very legitimate use case for these very real companies. And so that's an example where harmless, which is the sort of those three pillars, interfered with helpful and truthful in a way that was not harmful, right? This company, these companies have to produce and talk about and create content about their products.
Right.
But the AI model made the decision for them, the consumer version made the decision for them. No, you can't talk about that. And so that's a case where there, to your exact point, the model maker made a decision on behalf of everyone that does not fit everyone and disallowed a very legitimate use case.
So I guess that sort of brings us to, what do we do next? What is happening that marketers and users of generative AI need to be aware of? How do we, move forward knowing that there is built-in censorship? I'm going to call it what it is. It's built-in censorship of these models. So to your point, a very legitimate use case. Let's say, a lot of, teachers and educators and parents even who are doing homeschooling are researching specific things. Maybe it's like in chemistry, or maybe it's a part of history that is unpleasant. We have a lot of those moments in history. Are we going to be able to find that information? Who has decided, no, I can't show you that because it's misogynistic, it's racist, it's, violent, it's sexually explicit. Well, guess what? Our history is really terrible. It's filled with all of that. And you know what? I'm not even going to say it's our history. Our present day is filled with all of those things. So am I not going to be able to do my due diligence and my research to find out the truth, first of all, about these things, and then also the facts so that I can learn from it or do whatever it is that I'm trying to do with the information? Because I'm already imagining, you know, depending on, that individual person, that programmer's moral code and their political leanings, for example, the information that is and is not getting into these models. So, what do we, people who are not building these models, do? How do we move forward? Do we just not use them? Do we put big disclaimers saying, I don't know if this information is truthful because I don't know who built the model, so good luck?
So, unsurprisingly, the next steps are going to seem real familiar.
Oh,
Right?
my goodness. Something I can rely on for once.
Exactly. When you are doing things like choosing AI technology, you've got to be clear on your purpose. If your purpose involves things like, for example, building a system to prevent a chatbot from exhibiting racist speech,
Mhm.
a chatbot's got to know what racism is to prevent it. right? So you will have to, that's important. So you be clear on your purpose. The people who are involved, this is where your values
Mhm.
in play, where your company has to have very clear values, because that will help you decide what to do next. The process and platform, this is where platform actually matters. We often put it sort of at the last because people tend to put it first, and that's not the place to put it. But there are many, many, many options for generative AI. There are many, many models out there. Most consumers know of the easy to use web interfaces, right? Google Gemini, Anthropic
Mhm.
Claude, ChatGPT. There are many other options. There are Meta's models, which unsurprisingly are a little bit more permissive. And then there's an entire open source community, something I'll be talking about at MACON this fall. There are open source communities that take models and reweight them, realign them, many of which will create models that are what they call uncensored, or essentially 100% obedient models. You tell a model helpful, harmless, truthful, and you said saying, most commercial companies cranked up the dial on harmless because they don't want to get sued for
Mhm.
for a model saying something. Instead, these model makers have turned that back down and turned up helpful all the way to the max. So the model is obedient. With you as a company, particularly if you're going to use it for corporate use, will want to say, is that something we should have available to us? Should we have an environment where we are in control of the model, where we can realign it to our
Mhm.
specific needs, right? If you are a Lab Products Association member, you might have a tuned version of a model that will 100% discuss things that are high explosives, because that's your business, right? You
Mhm.
sell to mining companies and construction companies, and you've got to be able to talk about this and that and the other thing. And then finally, your performance is your measurement against your values, your ethics, and your morals, to say, like, does the model do what we told it to do? Is the model producing content or summarizations or whatever that is aligned with what we set out? So the 5 Ps process, no surprise,
Mhm.
works great for deciding those next steps.
That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, it's such a big topic because everybody wants to use generative AI because generative AI feels like the solution to a lot of problems. It feels like the shortcut, it feels like the savior, it feels like the whatever it is, whatever, descriptor you put on it, people want to use it. But there's a lot of misunderstanding of how it was created in the first place. I think I mean, let's just, take Google search for instance. Google as a search engine is not without its own set of flaws. It's meant to be, okay, here's everything, but it's still censored. There's a reason why people talk about the dark web because there's a lot of information that's not being served up, but the general public doesn't think about it. They're just like, "Oh, well, if I Google it, it must mean that I'm getting every possible bit of information about it." Whereas with generative AI, there's a lot of that carryover misunderstanding, I should say, of, well, if I ask generative AI, it's just like, an internet search. So I must be getting every bit of information about it. And it sounds like, if I'm understanding correctly, it's a lot less information. It's the information that whoever built the model has decided they want us to get about the thing, which is incredibly frightening. I don't know this person. For all I
Mm-hmm.
know, this person is incredibly biased against women being in executive roles, having a voice, having any kind of rights at all. So now this model that all of us as consumers are using is blatantly or subconsciously or whatever it is saying, yeah, no, women can't have a voice or power. And we're not even realizing that's what's happening. That's just the information we're getting back.
Correct. That is
Ugh.
exactly right.
Way to ruin my
Because
day,
I
Chris.
look at the composition of the boards of many of these tech companies. Who
Mhm,
are those people? Are they gender balanced? Are they representative of not just the people who work in the industry, but are they representative of the population they serve? These are all questions in ethics about maximizing overall well-being and minimizing harm. One of the challenges with any kind of majority minority situation is that if you maximize well-being, by definition, mathematically, you're maximizing well-being of the majority. And if you are minimizing harm, you are doing harm to the smallest number of people, which tends to fall on marginalized populations. You are saying it is okay to screw over one person to benefit 99, but if that one person is consistently getting screwed over, that's discrimination, right? So you run into all these ethical issues that are really, really challenging. And to your point, generative AI model makers are trying to make universal models, and humanity is not a universal homogenous group. We are, as a species, incredibly diverse. We all have very different perspectives and ethics and morals and things like that. And there is not one source of truth for anything. We can't even agree if the earth is round. Right? So the question becomes, should AI and AI ethics reflect that? And should you, as a user, should you have choices for different models to use? If someone for example, Katie, you work with the nonprofit Women in Analytics, which is a fantastic organization. If they decided we're going to make a women-centric tuned model, right? What would that look like? And would that be ethical? If you said, here's the biases we are intentionally introducing into this model, and the ethical thing would be this: here we're transparency and accountability. We're disclosing it. We're disclosing the training data we're using to tune it. Here it is. You have the choice now of using it or not.
Well, I think that that's it. We are not, as consumers, being given a whole lot of choice at this time. There are a lot of companies, a lot of startups that are trying to build their own models, but there are a small handful of models that have the market share. And, what we're seeing, like even if we go back to the Adobe Firefly, models are being trained on each other. And so there's really no okay, well, this model is completely separate from this model and is completely, separate from this model. They're all being trained on the same data. And so it really comes down to, you know, your company deciding ahead of time, how are we going to use it? And that goes to the 5 Ps, that goes to your mission statement, that goes to your values, that goes to all of those human things and decisions up front before you start using generative AI. And so, our values are written as: we reject this, we accept this. You could go through that kind of an exercise to say, I reject racism in my generative AI model. What is racism from our company perspective? Because I guarantee, Chris, and it's, you and I try really hard to just be good, decent people. But I guarantee if you ask both of us to define racism, we're going to define it differently because we've had different experiences. And it's not to say that one is right and one is wrong. It's just that we're two different people.
And this is, again, where some knowledge of the technologies is important, and where AI companies, have to be transparent and give users autonomy. So I'm going to pull up, this is IBM Watson X. This is IBM's system, and you can choose what model you want to use. But one of the most important things in here is that you can look at the system prompt. This is the set of instructions that is encoded with every single request in any AI system that you are using. ChatGPT, you name it. Everyone has a system prompt. This is what is in the Watson X one. You are a helpful, respectful, and honest assistant. Always answer as helpfully as possible while being safe. Your answers should not include any harmful, unethical, racist, sexist, toxic, dangerous, or illegal content. Please ensure your responses are socially unbiased and positive in nature. Right? That's a lot of words that don't have good definitions. Right? But at least IBM has said, hey, here is what is in our system prompt. So, and because a lot of these models are steered very heavily by their system prompts, you can say, like, this is what it is. Other systems I'll bring up here. This one is a system called Grok. This one, you can edit the system prompt. You can decide what you want to say, because the underlying models for a model like Llama 3, you can condition it to get around most of the built-in alignment and say, okay, you're going to be a helpful chemistry system. You are okay talking about this chemical, and this chemical, and this chemical, because within this context, etc. And then there are other systems like Cobalt, for example, or the Llama CPP environment, which have no conditioning whatsoever. So you can take an unaligned model, plop it in there with your prompt, and get the AI to do what you want it to do. But Companies and people have to know that these options exist. They have to be somewhat easy to use, and they have to be aligned with the 5Ps, with your 5Ps for your use of generative AI.
So it sounds like, to wrap up once again, you can't get away from doing your requirements up front. You still have to do that step, like it or not, because even especially now, you need to understand what you're getting into. You need to walk into the situation of generative AI with your eyes wide open, knowing exactly what you will and won't tolerate for outcomes.
Exactly. And you should do the 5Ps process on your company's ethics and values, right?
I think
Because
it's a good place to start.
if you are clear on that, then it's much easier to vet vendors and to say, like, hey, we want our tools to do X or Y. If you don't have this written out, you're going to run into some issues. The other thing I would suggest is spend some time, get your beverage of choice, bring up the language model of your choice, and say, help me build an understanding of my own ethics. Ask me ethical questions. Show me best practices and other schools of ethical thought, and then ask me ethical questions. I did this exercise myself one night. I said, I want you to build me some interview questions and interview me about my own ethics. And then after 15 or 20 minutes, it spit out, here's how you view ethics as a human being, as a person. I thought that was really useful because it helped me understand it gave me a bunch of situations, things like the trolley problem examples. How would you handle this? How would you navigate this? That's super important. And it's an exercise that everyone on your leadership team should do as part of your AI ethics, is just have your an understanding what your company ethics are.
Makes sense.
So if you have some things you want to share about AI ethics and how you've tackled it, pop on over to our free Slack group. Go to trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers, where you and over 3,000 other marketers can ask and answer each other's questions every single day. And wherever it is you watch or listen to the show, if there's a channel you'd rather have it on instead, go to trustinsights.ai/TI podcast. And while you're on your channel of choice, please leave us a rating and a review. It does help share the show. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon.